Today, we will dive into the most surprising move by the Big Stone Gap Post owners during the events of the Pound Gap Massacre and the issues with the interview of Judge T.M. Alderson itself. And while we believe that this interview was not shared with other newspapers of the time, even though it was making national headlines. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification button down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. The Bills of Exception. In his interview, Judge Alderson speaks about the Bill of Exceptions that had been prepared by him and his associates. He speaks about the 8 errors in the bill, but we are told by the often told story and the history of Wise County, Virginia, that a bill of 12 exceptions was prepared. Thankfully, Charles Johnson helps us to understand this discrepancy in his book. After the rendering of the verdict, Johnson tells us that Doc Taylor and his attorneys, quote, moved the court in arrest of judgment and to set aside the verdict of the jury and grant him a new trial for various grounds of error assigned at bar, unquote. Basically, this is a call for a mistrial, but the errors were assigned at bar. In other words, they were accusing the trial judge of making an unlawful mistake. We believe that the missing 4 errors came from the Alderson interview were errors assigned at bar, which would also explain why those 12 exceptions never made it to the appellate court. In the 1948 law book, The Assignment of Errors in Appellate Briefs, which we admit is a law book from the state of Washington, states that one of the main reasons the appellate laws were changed was because, in a lot of cases, the defense prepared bill exceptions did not make it to the appellate courts. Prior to the 1920s, the defense lawyers would write out the bills of exception. In comparison today, these bills would be comparable to an appellate brief. The bills would then be ordered attached to the transcript of the trial by the judge. The judge and or his staff would then prepare the appellate brief and send it to the appellate court. This happened in the trial of Dr. Taylor. However, we believe that just as in the example cases stated in the law book, Assignment of Errors in Appellate Briefs, the 12 exceptions from the Taylor trial never made it to the appellate court. We also believe that this occurred because just as the law book tells us, the 12 exceptions in the Taylor trial contained 4 errors assigned at bar. The law book goes on to tell us that this often occurred because these errors listed problems that could have resulted in a judge not only losing their judgeship, but could also result in disbarment. Was the Big Stone Gap complicit or compromised? Returning to the interview given by Judge Alderson. As we have already stated, the Alderson interview exclusively appeared in the Big Stone Gap Post. And while there may be several reasons for Judge Alderson's interview to remain exclusive, we believe that it is because the Big Stone Gap Post did not offer the interview to other newspapers. This, considering the circumstances, is extremely strange. Supposedly, the previous owner shut the newspaper down in April of 1892 because of poor circulation and he could not make money with the newspaper. The new owner, or owners, started the paper shortly after the Taylor trial in September of 1892. Another, on the whole, strange set of circumstantial timing, to say the least. At that time, newspapers not only made money from direct sales, but by offering their stories to other newspapers. This was in the days before syndication. Yet, for some reason, this story seems to have not been offered. This is extremely strange because at that time, there was extreme national interest in the Taylor trial and the Pound Gap Massacre. Could it be that someone or some group in Big Stone Gap or Wise County did not want to chance one of the appellate judges seeing this interview? Further explanation. To further explain this statement, we will first look at the entire interview. Quote, the Dr. Taylor case, unquote. Quote, Judge T.M. Alderson of Wise Courthouse came down Sunday and went over in Bristol on Monday's early train. Judge Alderson vigorously defended Dr. Taylor in his late trial for the Pound Gap Massacre and says, while he is convinced the jurymen in the case acted in accordance with their honest convictions, still he does not think the evidence in the case justified the verdict rendered. In referring to the different errors pointed out in the bill prepared and presented by himself and associates to the higher court, asking for a new trial, he said of the 8 pointed out, he thought that there was one alone sufficient to give them good grounds to expect a favorable decision, unquote. Quote, in this, he referred to the fact that 3 cartridge holes were picked up on the ground of the bloody massacre where the 5 people were murdered from ambush, that these holes were produced as evidence to show that they had been used in a gun the same caliber as owned by Taylor, which was the case. These shells, on examination, showed that the plunger of the gun in which they were exploded had struck the hull on one side, when ordinarily they would have been struck in the center, had the gun been in perfect order. Taylor's gun was tested during the trial, and in 5 shots it was found that the plunger struck the hull directly in the center, unquote. Quote, the case had been given to the jury, and it had retired to consider the evidence. This point came up. The jury sent for the gun, taking it to pieces, examined it out of court, and in the absence of the prisoner, and thought they had discovered that it had recently been tampered with, which Judge Alderson states was one of the leading points which caused them to render a verdict of murder in the first degree, unquote. The problems within this interview lies with true untrue statements that were found in the second paragraph. These statements are tacked on to the ends of 2 things that are known to be true. And if you are as familiar with the case as we are, you have probably already discovered what we are about to tell you just by hearing the interview being read aloud. The first true statement. The first true statement is about the 3 cartridge holes from the crime scene and ends with, quote, that these holes were produced as evidence to show that they had been used in a gun the same caliber as that owned by Taylor, unquote. The untrue and added statement being the ending of the sentence, quote, which was the case, unquote. This simply is not true. The cartridge holes were entered into evidence with the first witness called by the prosecution. When asked about these shell casings, the transcript states that the witness responded that they were 45 by 75 caliber. However, as we have discussed in earlier videos, we believe that most, but not all, of the statements about the caliber of the ammunition and Dr. Taylor's rifle had been changed in a copy of the transcript sent to the appellate court. This, we believe, is verified in the testimony of Jemima Harris. She testifies about an attempt on the life of Ira Mullins, which had occurred on April of 1892. In her testimony, she states that she believes that a bullet recovered from Ira's bed had been a .44 caliber. Jemima is then asked if she knew that Dr. Taylor carried a .44 caliber pistols. It is at this point that we believe that the prosecution introduced Taylor's pistols into evidence. But these pistols are quickly dismissed as the murder weapon, simply because they were long Colt .45s. The Colts were center fire and could not be the murder weapon because they did not match the shell casings. It is from this point forward that the prosecution abandons the pistols and focuses on Dr. Taylor's rifle, even though the court did not have possession of it, nor did they know where it was. Here we must pause for a moment to briefly speak about the indictment against Dr. Taylor, Adams, and the Fleming brothers. The original indictment had been issued by the grand jury, which had been sworn in on April 26, 1892. It had been dated on the 14th day of May, 1892, and stated that they had killed Ira Mullins with a gun valued at $5. This indictment was quashed or thrown out because one of the grand jurors had owned a business which was against Virginia law at the time. A new indictment was sought out from the grand jury, which had just been sworn in that morning and was issued on July 26, 1892. Unlike the previous grand jury, this jury heard no evidence. They issued an indictment which listed only M.B. Taylor as the defendant and contained the correction that he had killed Ira Mullins with a pistol valued at $5. This indictment had no date listed. When the evidence showed that the pistols could not have been a murder weapon, the trial should have ended in a mistrial. This is probably one of the exceptions which Judge Alderson spoke about in his interview. But to get around this issue, the court simply attached a new indictment as a second count to the first quashed and edited indictment. Before both indictments were attached as a single indictment onto the transcript and sent to the appellate court. The thing to remember here is that when Dr. Taylor was arrested, he had only been carrying his pistols. The second true statement. The second problem within the interview is attached to another true statement about the 3 cartridge holes in which states, quote, "These shells, on examination, showed that the plunger of the gun in which they were exploded had struck the hole on one side," unquote. In all likelihood, this was probably the end of this statement by Judge Alderson. We believe that either the reporter or an editor added the untrue statement. Quote, "When ordinarily they would have been struck in the center, had the gun been in perfect order," unquote. However, whoever did so did not realize that this untrue statement was out of place and could simply be contradicted when you consider the true statements both before and after it. The next line in the interview reads, quote, "Taylor's gun was tested during the trial, and in 5 shots it was found that the plunger struck the hole directly in the center," unquote. The second untrue statement is completely out of order and only makes sense if both statements we have tagged as untrue are in fact true. But we know this is simply not the case. We know this thanks to the testimony of Jemima Harris, the affidavit of Ian Mills, the interview of Judge Alderson, and the often told story. The story, the affidavit, and the interview all tells us that the shell casings found at the crime scene, quote, had been struck on one side, unquote, instead of in the center. The testimony of Jemima Harris tells us that the prosecution thought that Ira had been killed with one of Taylor's pistols. We also know that after her testimony, the prosecution never brings up the pistols again. This can only mean one thing. The shell casings found at the crime scene were in fact .44 caliber rimfire ammunition and did not match Taylor's pistols nor his rifle. How do we know this to be true? One last issue. I was recently asked, quote, "How do you know that the shell casings found at the crime scene were not .44 WCF or Winchester centerfire ammunition?" This is a great question. Although there is no mention of it in the interview of Judge Alderson, the Mills affidavit, or the transcript of the trial. The often told story tells us that Dr. Taylor's rifle had been dry fired using one of the shell casings found at the crime scene. In this story, it is always stated that the plunger or firing pin struck the shell just off center. First, a rimfire weapon cannot discharge center fire ammunition, nor the reverse. Second, it is true that .44 caliber ammunition is made in both rim and centerfire variants. And in 1894, Winchester released a rifle that would fire both types of ammunition. This release was paired with the release of a kit that would replace the firing mechanism in older rifles, enabling them to use both variants as well. This game-changing renovation led to Winchester's 44s being declared, quote, the gun that won the West, unquote. Third, we know that Dr. Taylor's rifle was an 1876 Winchester Centennial. It was the first big game rifle that Winchester released. It was a center fire, and although it could discharge a 44 WCF bullet, it would have struck the 44 WCF just off center, but it would still fire. However, because of the differences between the 45-75 ammunition made for the Centennial, each of the 44 shells would have to be hand-loaded into his rifle. The counter-argument was this, quote, so how do you know he wasn't using a 44 WCF ammunition in his pistols? Unquote. Because of the testimony of Jemima Harris. She testifies that she thinks a bullet retrieved from Ira's bed in April was a 44 caliber. Although the questions asked by the prosecution or the defense were not recorded in court transcripts of the time, we know that she was asked the question about Taylor's pistols because she replies that she, quote, didn't know that Dr. Taylor carried a 44 pistol, unquote. We believe that the pistols were entered into evidence at that time. We also believe that no other questions about the pistols occurred during the trial because the shell casings were rimfire. If the casings had been 44 WCF, they would have been fired in Taylor's centerfire Colt 45s, but they would have struck the shells just off center, but the shell casings had been struck on the side. Lastly, Winchester and most other manufacturers made it easy to visually tell the difference between the rim-fired and the center-fired ammunition. While the rim-fired ammunition has a smooth bottom, the center-fired ammunition has a circular indent where the primer sets in the shell casings. Thank you. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Killing Rock, also known as the Pound Gap Massacre. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.